The clock had just slipped past 2 o'clock in the morning at Buckingham Palace when the night stopped being normal. The long corridors were dark. The doors were sealed. The palace had already moved into that silent overnight mode where almost nothing shifts except the guards. Even the air in places like that feels controlled, as if every sound knows it should stay small. Then one alarm went off. Not in a public hallway. Not near a guest wing. Not in one of the grand rooms tourists dream about. It came from deep inside one of the palace's most protected areas, a restricted corridor tied to a royal vault that almost nobody talks about in public. At first, the people monitoring security thought it might be a fault. Old buildings do that. Ancient walls, aging systems, strange electrical glitches. In a place as old as Buckingham Palace, a false alarm is not the wildest thing in the world. But when guards checked the feed, the room reportedly changed. Because the figure on camera was not a technician. Not a senior official. Not a member of the overnight security team. It was Tom Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla's son, walking alone through a corridor that should have been sealed until sunrise. And that was the moment this stopped being a minor palace problem. That was the moment it became a family problem, a security problem, and maybe even something worse. What many people do not know is that palace panic does not look like panic in ordinary places. Nobody screams. Nobody runs around in caves. It gets colder than that. Messages start moving through private channels. Senior staff are woken quietly. Questions begin before anyone has answers. And the people who do know something suddenly become very careful with their words. That is exactly what insiders say happened here. Within minutes, the footage was being reviewed, access logs were being checked, and the one question nobody could answer cleanly was also the most dangerous one: how did he get in? Because this was not a corridor someone could casually wander into after making a wrong turn. The area tied to the vault was said to be protected by layers of clearance, electronic records, locked checkpoints, and tightly controlled permissions. Even many longtime staff members were believed to have no reason to go near it. So when Tom Parker Bowles allegedly appeared there at 2 a.m., the issue was not just that he was present. It was that his presence suggested a door had opened for him. Maybe literally. Maybe institutionally. Either way, people inside the palace understood the same thing at once. If someone had entered that section of the building, then either the system had failed, or someone had helped. And neither explanation was comforting. Accounts from palace insiders say the overnight team did what they were supposed to do. They checked the logs. They reviewed the corridor feed. They tried to find an explanation that would make the whole thing smaller, less explosive, easier to file away before sunrise. But the more they looked, the less ordinary it seemed. The logs reportedly showed movement in a time window when movement should have been impossible. That matters. Because a strange figure on footage is one thing. A strange figure on footage backed up by system activity is something else entirely. It gives the whole event weight. It pushes the story out of the zone of rumor and into the zone of internal crisis. By the early hours of that morning, the issue had reportedly climbed well above routine security staff. Quiet calls were made. Senior aides were pulled in. The kind of people who usually handle ceremonial planning and private household business were now dealing with a question nobody wanted attached to the monarchy. Who, exactly, had access to one of its most sensitive spaces in the middle of the night? And then Princess Anne was informed. Now, if you know anything about Princess Anne, you know why that mattered immediately. Anne has long carried a reputation inside royal circles for being direct, disciplined, and not especially patient with nonsense. She is not usually described as dramatic. She is described as serious. The kind of person who does not enjoy institutional chaos, and certainly does not ignore it when it lands on her doorstep before dawn. So when palace insiders say she was disturbed enough to demand answers right away, that tells you a lot. It tells you this was not being treated as a silly misunderstanding. It tells you the people closest to the matter understood how ugly it looked. And it tells you the story inside those walls had already started splitting into two versions, the one people might eventually say in public, and the one that was unfolding in private rooms before the sun came up. There is something else here that makes the whole thing feel even darker. The royal vault was never described as a simple storage room. According to those familiar with the palace's internal structure, the surrounding secured areas were believed to hold highly sensitive materials, private family correspondence, historic ceremonial records, legal documents, and possessions linked to generations of the monarchy. That does not prove something was taken, but it explains why everyone reacted the way they did. Because if Tom Parker Bowles had been spotted near a harmless administrative hallway, this would have been embarrassing. If he had been spotted near a place tied to the monarchy's private archives, it became something with far heavier consequences. Suddenly, every possibility felt bad. Was he there with permission? Was he there without it? Was someone protecting him? Was someone trying to bury the whole thing before daylight? And if this incident had happened once, had something like it happened before without being caught? Those are the kinds of questions that do real damage inside institutions built on silence, routine, and hierarchy. Especially one like the royal family. By sunrise, the palace no longer had the luxury of pretending this was small. The overnight hush had broken. Staff were speaking in lowered voices. Security personnel were being questioned. Internal movement around the restricted wing was reportedly tightened. The place was still outwardly calm, but that kind of calm can be misleading. Sometimes the quietest buildings hold the loudest secrets. And Buckingham Palace, that morning, was full of them. Because the deeper issue was no longer just Tom Parker Bowles on a camera. It was the possibility that one of the monarchy's most protected systems was not as protected as everyone had believed. That is when the story began to spread through the palace in the way royal trouble always does, first as a whisper, then as a pattern, then as a fear nobody can quite contain. And the worst part? This was only the beginning. By the time Princess Anne arrived, the mood inside Buckingham Palace had changed completely. The guards were still in position. The doors were still polished. The building still looked like the same old symbol of order and control. But people inside it knew the atmosphere had shifted. The overnight calm was gone. In its place was that brittle kind of tension that settles over institutions when everyone senses the official version has not yet been decided. And, according to palace sources, did not waste time. She reportedly pushed for movement to stop around the restricted wing. Access records were frozen. Officers were called in. Questions were asked with more edge than usual. This was not the response of someone mildly annoyed by a late-night mix-up. This was the response of someone who believed the palace might already be in deeper trouble than it wanted to admit. To understand why Anne reacted this way, you have to look at the culture around places like this. Royal households do not run on rules alone. They run on habit, hierarchy, private understandings, old loyalties, and a strange kind of trust that can become dangerous when nobody checks it closely enough. For years, that system can look elegant, efficient even, until one night exposes how much of it depends on people simply behaving. And what many people do not know is that this kind of hidden weakness often stays buried until something forces it into the light. According to those familiar with the review, Anne quickly ran into a problem that made the whole affair more suspicious. The explanations she was hearing did not match. Some said Tom Parker Bowles may have received temporary access to an internal arrangement connected to the household. Others insisted that was not credible at all, because the vault corridor required a specific level of authorization that should not be casually handed out or quietly bypassed. That contradiction mattered more than people outside the palace might think. Because when two explanations show up that fast, it usually means one of two things. Either nobody knows what happened, which is bad, or some people know exactly what happened and are testing which version sounds safest, which is worse. And reportedly pressed hardest on one question above all others: who controlled the relevant access permissions that night? Simple question. Brutal implications. If Tom entered that corridor with genuine clearance, someone had to approve it. If he entered without it, someone had to fail. And if the system recorded movement without a clear authorized path, then the palace had a structural problem that went beyond one man on one night. This is where the story starts feeling less like a one-off scandal and more like a glimpse into how power really moves behind old walls. Because systems built on private exceptions always seem manageable until one exception becomes visible. Insiders say that as the morning continued, concerns spread through staff quarters and private offices. Not because there was proof of theft. Not because anyone had publicly accused Tom Parker Bowles of taking something. But because nobody could produce a quick, believable answer that made his presence harmless. That silence did its own damage. People started asking quiet questions about how secure the restricted archives really were. Had access privileges been reviewed properly over the years? Were certain people treated more casually than policy allowed? Had relationships inside the household created informal pathways into places that were supposed to be tightly controlled? When those questions begin, institutions like the monarchy do not just worry about the truth. They worry about the pattern. And patterns are harder to shut down. By that afternoon, attention had reportedly shifted from the footage itself to the contents of the vault, and the records attached to it. On paper, this was an internal verification process. In practice, it sounds like something much heavier, a search for reassurance that became its own source of alarm. According to those familiar with the internal review, officials examining archived listings and stored materials began noticing discrepancies. At first, there were efforts to explain them away. Old records can be messy. Historic archives can be difficult to track. Filing systems built across decades, sometimes centuries, are not always clean. That is the easy explanation. It is the one every institution reaches for when things begin to wobble. But insiders say that explanation did not hold for long. As checks continued, concerns reportedly grew over items and records that could not be immediately reconciled with archived listings. Some whispered about historic valuables. Others worried over private correspondence. Some believed the issue might not be missing objects at all, but missing certainty. And honestly, that may be worse. Because if a highly protected archive cannot tell clearly what is there, what was there, and who had reason to access it, then the problem is no longer one suspicious night. The problem is a long-running weakness no one wanted tested. The vault was supposed to represent control. Instead, it was beginning to reveal confusion. That is the part of this story that hits hardest. Not because it proves every wild theory people might invent, but because it creates the space for them. And once that space opens around the royal family, it fills fast. And reportedly refused to treat the discrepancies as a paperwork nuisance. From her point of view, the existence of unexplained gaps in a heavily restricted archive was already serious enough. Whether something had been physically removed or whether the records themselves were unreliable, either option was damaging. One suggested breach. The other suggested negligence. Neither was acceptable. Meanwhile, people close to Tom Parker Bowles were said to be pushing back on the growing panic. Their line, according to reports, was that no illegal activity had occurred and that the matter was being inflated by fear, confusion, and palace overreaction. That may sound like a decent defense on the surface. But it left the main question hanging untouched. Why was he there? Not vaguely. Not emotionally. Literally. Why was he in that corridor, at that hour, in that building, under those conditions? That question stayed in the air because no answer came to meet it. And the longer it sat there, the more dangerous the whole affair became. This is also where Prince William reportedly enters the picture in a meaningful way. He was said to have been privately briefed as the scope of concern widened. At first, he was receiving information. Later, according to palace-linked sources, he became more actively engaged, disturbed not just by the image of Tom Parker Bowles near the vault, but by what the incident seemed to reveal about the palace itself. That matters because William, like Anne, was reportedly less comfortable with simply smoothing the situation over in private. He was believed to view the whole episode as something the monarchy could not afford to dismiss, especially at a time when public trust was already fragile and every sign of special treatment drew sharper criticism than it might have years ago. And now the lines inside the family were becoming clearer. Princess, and pushing for accountability. Prince William reportedly aligned with serious internal scrutiny. Queen Camilla, according to insiders, more focused on containment and protecting her son from a scandal that could spiral into something far larger. And King Charles caught in the middle. You do not need anyone to raise their voice for that to become explosive. All you need is loyalty pulling in different directions. By the end of that day, the palace was no longer just dealing with a security incident. It was dealing with mistrust. And once mistrust enters a royal household, every locked door starts to look different. If Buckingham Palace still had a chance to keep the whole thing inside the building, that chance did not last long. Because the real crisis began when the footage, or at least details from it, reportedly reached journalists and royal commentators. That changed everything. Until then, the problem had been severe but private. The palace could still hope to manage it through internal reviews, family conversations, and carefully limited knowledge. Once the story started leaking beyond the walls, that option disappeared. By the next morning, the question was no longer being whispered only inside staff corridors. It was being asked outside. Why had Queen Camilla's son allegedly been seen near one of the monarchy's most restricted areas in the middle of the night? That is the kind of question that does not sit quietly in Britain. The royal family lives on a strange balance. It depends on privacy, but survives on public legitimacy. And when the public begins to suspect that private privilege is overriding public standards, the damage can spread much faster than the facts. Inside the palace communications office, insiders say the reaction was immediate. Coverage was monitored closely. Options were weighed. Some thought silence was safest. If the palace confirmed nothing, perhaps the story would thin out under the weight of speculation. Others thought the opposite. They believed silence would pour fuel on everything, because in stories like this, the absence of an explanation never creates calm. It creates a vacuum. And that vacuum gets filled by the boldest, darkest, most dramatic version available. That is exactly what happened. Online commentators began throwing out theories at speed. Some thought Tom Parker Bowles may have been searching for sensitive royal papers. Others wondered whether the vault held private family correspondence tied to old controversies. A few pushed for caution and argued there might be a simple explanation buried under a wave of secrecy and panic. But with no clear public account, every theory had room to breathe. And the loudest ones always breathed deepest. Former palace staff and royal commentators added to the pressure. Some spoke publicly about how difficult it would be to enter those areas without help. Others suggested parts of palace security had, for too long, relied on trust, familiarity, and informal arrangements more than strict, modern accountability. Nobody had to accuse anyone directly. The structure of the doubt was already enough. If access to a place like that depended partly on who was trusted rather than what was verified, then the palace had a bigger problem than one leaked night. That possibility appears to have hit Princess and hard. According to insiders, she saw the leak as proof that private containment had failed. The story was now public. Whether the palace liked it or not, credibility was at stake. Her view, as described by those close to the matter, was not simply that the media wanted blood. It was that the monarchy could not demand respect while refusing to answer basic questions about a breach tied to one of its most sensitive spaces. That put her on a collision path with those who believed the story itself was becoming more dangerous than the underlying event. Queen Camilla, according to reports, remained strongly resistant to turning the situation into a wider public reckoning. From that perspective, every fresh headline deepened damage to the institution and to her son, while still proving very little in a hard legal sense. There was no public evidence that Tom had taken anything. No official announcement of theft. No open declaration of wrongdoing. That is true. But it was never enough to settle the bigger issue. Because the incident had already moved beyond the narrow question of whether something had been stolen. It had become a test of standards. Do different rules apply when someone is close to the crown? Would the palace show the same urgency if the person on camera had not been tied to the queen? Would the truth have surfaced at all if the footage had never leaked? Those are dangerous questions because they cut past the event and land on the monarchy's moral position. And inside the palace, another emergency was now unfolding alongside the first, who leaked the footage. According to sources, that became a major internal concern. Some believed a worried insider had passed it along because they feared the incident would otherwise vanish into palace silence. Others suspected something more strategic, that rival factions inside the household had become so divided they were willing to use the media against one another. If that second possibility is even partly true, it is devastating. Because then the palace was not only facing a possible external embarrassment, it was facing internal warfare. And internal warfare inside a royal household is always uglier than it looks from the outside, because it hides itself behind protocol, caution, and polite language. The knives are wrapped in velvet. While public attention intensified, the internal review reportedly widened. Security teams began looking beyond the single night in question and into older access patterns tied to the surrounding archive areas and other restricted palace sections. That review, according to those close to it, focused on 3 issues: who had authorization, how those permissions had been granted over time, and whether anyone had used them in ways that should have triggered closer oversight. What they reportedly found was deeply uncomfortable. Permissions may have been granted or extended in ways that were not always documented with the rigor one might expect. Certain clearances may have remained active for long stretches without proper review. And unusual movement may not always have been flagged with the seriousness it deserved. In other words, the vault incident may have exposed not just a breach, but a culture. A culture of exceptions. A culture of trust without enough verification. A culture where people close to power could move through systems built for a different age. That is why this story kept growing. Not because each rumor was proven. Not because every whispered theory was true. But because the underlying structure sounded plausible enough to frighten even people inside the palace. The nightmare was no longer just that Tom Parker Bowles had been there. The nightmare was that his presence might have revealed how long the system had been relying on informal privilege. Prince William, according to multiple reports, was said to be disturbed by exactly that. His concern was not only about one corridor or one member of the extended family. It was about precedent. If something this serious could be softened, blurred, or quietly buried, what message would that send about the monarchy's future? For William, who is so often viewed through the lens of what kind of king he may one day become, the issue reportedly carried institutional weight. A monarchy already under pressure could not afford to look as though standards bent most easily around the people closest to it. King Charles, meanwhile, was said to be trying to keep the peace. That sounds sensible, but peace can become its own kind of trap when every side thinks delay is helping the other side more. Meetings reportedly became tense. Staff morale worsened. Senior aides were no longer dealing with a single question about access. They were managing a storm of divided loyalties, public pressure, and growing suspicion inside the family itself. And through all of that, one thing remained astonishingly unchanged. Tom Parker Bowles still had not offered a clear public explanation for why he was there. That silence became a character in the story all by itself. Because a denial without an explanation does not end suspicion. It feeds it. By the end of the first week, the palace was no longer merely handling an incident. It was living through a fracture. And the crack ran right through the family. By the time the story had run through days of whispers, leaks, internal checks, and mounting coverage, the palace had a much bigger problem than a single night caught on camera. It had a credibility crisis. That is the real truth sitting underneath everything. Not necessarily the truth of what Tom Parker Bowles did or did not do in that corridor. Not the final truth about whether anything was removed from the vault, or whether the records were simply flawed. Those details, even now in this account, remain shadowed by competing claims and institutional silence. The deeper truth is that the incident exposed how fragile old systems become when modern scrutiny finally lands on them. Accounts from journalists, palace-linked sources, and royal observers all point to the same unsettling picture. A restricted area was entered under suspicious circumstances. Explanations did not line up. Internal records reportedly raised further concern. Senior royals were pulled into disagreement over what to do next. And then the matter escaped into public view before the institution had decided how to explain itself. That is not just a bad week. That is a serious warning sign. What many people do not know is that royal institutions often survive not by answering every accusation, but by projecting stability so consistently that the public keeps assuming there must be a system behind the curtain. The palace does not need to look perfect. It needs to look controlled. This story did the opposite. It made the palace look uncertain. It made the household look divided. And perhaps most dangerously of all, it made the internal machinery of privilege visible. Because once people start asking whether special access, quiet exceptions, and informal protections exist behind the scenes, they do not stop at one event. They begin rethinking the entire structure. That is why Princess Anne's position matters in this story. According to insiders, her urgency was never just about one breach. It was about the idea that unresolved crises rot institutions from the inside. Silence may buy time, but it also feeds suspicion. And suspicion, once rooted in public consciousness, is very hard to reverse. Prince William's reported stance matters for a similar reason. He is not just another royal relative. He is the future of the institution in the eyes of many. If he was indeed more aligned with Anne's push for accountability, then this story may have quietly revealed something important about the future struggle inside the monarchy. Whether survival now depends more on control or on transparency. That is not a small question. It is one of the central questions facing the royal family in the modern age. Queen Camilla's position, if the reports are accurate, is also deeply human. A mother protecting her son is not shocking. In another family, in another setting, many people would understand the instinct immediately. But this is not another family. This is a family tied to the crown, to public money, to constitutional symbolism, to centuries of expectation. Protection exercised from that position does not stay private. It reshapes how people interpret fairness itself. And that is where the emotional sting of this story really lives. Because at its heart, this was not only about corridors, cameras, and codes. It was about whether power changes the rules. The public reaction reflected exactly that tension. Commentators, viewers, former staff, and ordinary observers were not all focused on the same detail, but they kept circling the same feeling. That if someone less connected had been caught in a similarly sensitive area at 2 a.m., the institutional response might have looked very different. That perception hurts the monarchy even if every darker rumor turns out to be false. Why? Because institutions are judged not just by what they prove, but by what they appear willing to tolerate. And this story made the palace appear far more comfortable with silence than with clarity. Even now, the biggest questions remain hanging in the same cold air where the alarm first sounded. How did Tom Parker Bowles gain access to that corridor? Who had the authority to make that possible? Were the inventory problems evidence of removal, evidence of weak record-keeping, or evidence of something the palace still does not want fully examined? Who leaked the footage? And did that person act out of conscience, fear, revenge, or strategy? There has been no clean public closure to any of it in the version you provided. That absence matters. Because unresolved stories do not disappear around royal institutions. They harden into symbols. They become the reference point people use when the next scandal arrives. They settle into the public memory as proof that one more truth was handled behind closed doors. There is also a darker layer here that should not be missed. If the wider internal review truly suggested years of permissions, extensions, and access habits that were not rigorously examined, then the vault night was not simply a shock. It was a revelation. Not necessarily of one criminal act, but of an old culture still operating on assumptions that no longer survive public scrutiny. That may be the most uncomfortable possibility of all. Not that one person slipped through, but that too many people had grown used to doors opening quietly. In the end, Tom Parker Bowles stands at the center of the image everyone remembers, a figure in a restricted corridor, deep in Buckingham Palace, at an hour when he should not have been there. But the image became larger than the man. Around him gathered Princess Anne's demand for answers, Prince William's reported concern, Queen Camilla's instinct to protect, and King Charles's struggle to contain a dispute pulling at both family and institution. That is why this story holds attention. It is not just scandal. It is anatomy. A look at how monarchy behaves when secrecy fails. A look at what power does when family loyalty and public duty collide. A look at the distance between image and reality inside one of the most controlled households in the world. And maybe that is why the story refuses to feel finished. Because the vault may be sealed. The official rooms may still be polished. The doors may still close softly. But the questions opened that night are much louder than the alarm that started them. They speak to something bigger than one corridor in Buckingham Palace. They speak to the old bargain at the heart of royalty itself, the idea that people will accept privilege, ceremony, and protection, but only if they still believe the standards apply when it matters most. When that belief shakes, everything shakes with it. And that is what made this one night feel so dangerous. Not just what was seen, but what it seemed to reveal.